March 10, 1945, 4:42 a.m., as a grey veil of pre-dawn mist drifted through the mountains of Lubang Island in the Philippines, the jungle held its breath, waiting for a war that was already ending everywhere else. But not here, not for the young Japanese intelligence officer Hiroo Onoda, who crouched beneath a dripping canopy of palm leaves, listening to distant gunfire and believing with absolute conviction that the empire still depended on him. The world far beyond this island was collapsing. Tokyo was burning under B-29 raids. Okinawa was about to erupt into hell, and the Japanese High Command, fragmented, desperate, battered, had begun preparing for the unthinkable possibility of surrender. But none of that reached Lubang. None of it reached Onoda. In these jungles, the war lived on as vividly as the insects humming in the undergrowth and the rustling branches swaying overhead. The air smelled of wet soil and rotting fruit, the earth still scarred from recent skirmishes with American and Filipino guerrilla units, and Onoda felt the weight of duty settle onto his shoulders like the humidity pressing against his skin. He was 22 years old, trained in psychological operations and guerrilla tactics, and he had been given one final order before his superior officers evacuated the island. "You are absolutely forbidden to die. You will conduct intelligence operations. You will live off the land. You will not surrender. You will not take your own life. The empire will return for you." Orders like these were not suggestions. They were vows, bound by honor, reinforced by a lifetime of indoctrination that glorified sacrifice and obedience. And so, as the sky lightened into pale blue and the American invasion of Lubang approached its final phase, Onoda prepared for a mission he believed might last months, never imagining it would last 29 years. The American landing forces swept through the island with overwhelming efficiency, supported by Filipino guerrillas who knew every ridge and river. Japanese positions collapsed quickly. Command posts fell silent. Ammunition dumps erupted in fireballs that shook the jungle floor. Onoda, operating deep in the hills, watched the destruction from a distance, binoculars pressed to his face, heart pounding as he saw the banners of the empire torn down one by one. To him, this was not defeat, only temporary loss of ground. He had been trained to expect confusion, to remain resilient when cut off from central command. The key was survival, evasion, patience. The emperor's will would outlast any temporary occupation. That morning, Onoda and a handful of remaining soldiers, Private First Class Yuichi Akotsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimoda, and Private Kinshichi Kozuka, slipped into the densest part of the island's interior, a maze of ravines and towering trees where daylight struggled to reach the ground. The jungle became their fortress. The thick vines strangling tree trunks served as camouflage. The narrow ravines shielded them from aerial reconnaissance. Streams provided fresh water, though the taste of mud and decay lingered on their tongues. Onoda led them with a calm, decisive authority. His mission was clear: continue guerrilla resistance, gather intelligence, sabotage enemy operations, and wait for the Japanese counteroffensive that would surely come. But the counteroffensive never came. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and Lubang Island's new silence grew heavy, unnatural. No Japanese supply boats arrived under cover of night. No aircraft dropped messages or equipment. No coded transmissions crackled through the small radio Onoda guarded with near-religious devotion. The men found only static. Onoda interpreted the silence through the lens of his training. The communications blackout must mean Japan was preparing a large-scale counterstrike. They had not been abandoned, only placed in deep cover operations. Every snapped twig in the jungle became, to Onoda, the footstep of an enemy patrol. Every distant explosion became evidence of continued fighting somewhere beyond the island's horizon. When the Americans declared the island secured, they dropped leaflets from aircraft urging remaining Japanese soldiers to surrender. Onoda picked one up, studying the neat printed lines with narrowed eyes. The message claimed Japan had capitulated, that the war was over, that remaining troops should lay down their arms for their own safety. Onoda crushed the leaflet in his fist. It was too convenient, too polished, too perfect. "Psychological warfare," he said to his men. "The Americans think we are fools." And so the 4 soldiers stepped deeper into the shadows of the island, where bamboo thickets whispered in the wind, where monkeys shrieked overhead, and where they would build their hidden camps, small shelters of woven branches, lean-tos fashioned from palm leaves, pits for fires that were rarely lit for fear of detection. Months bled into years. The jungle became their universe. They stalked the edges of villages at night, stealing rice, coconuts, bananas, and occasionally livestock. Farmers whispered of spirits haunting the hills, spirits who stole their food, their tools, their animals. But these were no spirits. They were 4 Japanese soldiers, surviving on instinct, discipline, and unbreakable delusion. When villagers tried to leave offerings with surrender leaflets attached, Onoda rejected them as Allied trickery. When radios broadcast news of Japan's defeat on August 15, 1945, he dismissed it as fabricated. "If Japan had fallen," Onoda told his men, "we would have received direct orders. Until then, we continue." And so, they continued. Rain fell in endless curtains during monsoon season, turning the forest floor into rivers of muck. The men slept on raised platforms of bamboo so their bodies would not sink into the mud at night. Their uniforms rotted. Their boots disintegrated. Their rifles rusted from humidity and were cleaned obsessively with strips of cloth torn from their own clothing. Fever visited often. Malaria lay dormant in every mosquito bite. Their bodies grew leaner, harder, sunburned and scarred. Yet their resolve, especially Onoda's, did not break. Each morning, Onoda inspected the perimeter, scanning for tracks, listening for distant voices, noting the movements of villagers and patrols. His mind ran constantly through tactical calculations, where to attack, where to retreat, where to hide supplies. To him, this was war, unchanged, unending. Years after Japan surrendered, search parties came. They carried megaphones and called the soldiers names. They promised safety. They begged them to come out. Onoda studied the search parties from the brush, heart pounding, rifle aimed. "The enemy has learned our names," he warned. "More psychological warfare." His companions nodded silently. Their faith in him was absolute. Their isolation had fused their identities into a single purpose: obey the last order, survive, and fight. Seasons cycled endlessly. Typhoons roared across the island, tearing trees from the earth. Droughts turned streams into dry riverbeds. Wild pigs trotted through abandoned Japanese camps, sniffing old tin cans left behind years before. And still, Onoda's war continued. When fishermen approached the jungle's edge, he and his men fired warning shots. When Filipino police ventured too close, skirmishes broke out. Newspapers across the Philippines reported sightings of Japanese holdouts who refused to accept the war's end. By the early 1950s, the search for Onoda and his companions had become a strange legend, part fear, part curiosity. Japan, rebuilding itself from ashes, had no desire to dwell on ghosts of the past. But Onoda did not know Japan had changed. He did not know skyscrapers were rising in Tokyo, that children carried American school supplies, that the emperor had renounced his divinity. To Onoda, Japan remained as it had been in 1945, defiant, desperate, fighting for survival. And then, in 1950, the first cracks began to form. One night, after years of silence, Yuichi Akotsu slipped away from the camp. He wandered alone, weary and half-starved, and eventually surrendered to Filipino authorities. When Onoda discovered his disappearance, he concluded Akotsu had been captured. But when leaflets appeared declaring that Akotsu was safe and urging the others to surrender, Onoda believed the Americans were using him as bait. "They are forcing him to lie," Onoda said. "He is a prisoner." Yet a part of him, deep buried, felt the first tremor of doubt. For now, though, Hiroo Onoda tightened his grip on reality as he understood it. His war was far from over. March 1946, 5:40 a.m., as a pale curtain of fog drifted across the humid jungles of Lubang Island, the new dawn revealed a world that believed the war was over, yet Hiroo Onoda did not. To him, this quiet morning was only another phase of an ongoing campaign, another day in a mission he refused to abandon. Birds called from distant branches, leaves trembled with the stirring of unseen animals, and the wind carried the faint scent of salt from the nearby sea, but none of this felt peaceful. Every sound was a warning. Every movement was a message. Every shadow demanded interpretation. The war, as far as Onoda was concerned, had merely changed shape. For Onoda, the jungle was not refuge, it was battlefield. He watched the villagers from high ridges, observing them carry sacks of rice, herd goats, or gather water. Their normality was suspicious. Their calmness made no sense. If the Americans had truly won, why would villagers move without fear? Why would they not hide? His training as an intelligence officer shaped every conclusion. The villagers were cooperating with the enemy. Their daily routines were signals. Their glances were codes. Their familiarity with the land made them dangerous. The world saw civilians. Onoda saw collaborators. His duty was to survive and continue operations, and those orders echoed in his mind with a force stronger than hunger, sickness, or exhaustion. You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. You must survive. Continue your operations. Those words kept him rooted in a mission long after Japan had laid down its weapons. As the months turned into a year and the year stretched into two, the jungle became his entire world, its dangers familiar, its rhythms predictable, its silence a companion stronger than any memory of home. Rain soaked him for days at a time. Nights chilled him. He repaired his uniform with bark fibers and vines. He resoled his boots using scraps of rubber found near streams. He treated every object as a resource, every day as a test. His rifle never left his hands, its metal wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from the endless humidity. He slept lightly, waking at the snap of a twig, believing that Allied patrols could be a few steps away. He collected rainwater in bamboo tubes, ate coconuts and bananas, and learned the movements of wild pigs that roamed the undergrowth. Fire was too dangerous. Smoke meant exposure, so he lived without warmth, without cooked meals, without light in the darkest nights. Yet none of this weakened his resolve. This isolation was not suffering. It was service. In the quiet moments, when fog hung low over the ravines and insects buzzed through the thick heat, he sometimes wondered why no Japanese units came to relieve him. But he brushed those doubts aside. His commanders would come. They had to come. Then came the leaflets. Thin sheets of paper fluttering from the sky, drifting into the jungle like strange white birds. "Japan has surrendered," they said. "Return home." Onoda stared at them, reading every line carefully. They were too crude, too vague, too theatrical to be real. Why would Japan surrender without sending an officer? Why would they announce it by dropping leaflets into the jungle? To Onoda, this was American psychological warfare, an attempt to lure out remaining Japanese soldiers. Soon after, more leaflets arrived, more messages, more printed words insisting the war was over. Then came letters supposedly written by his family. Then came photographs, shouts through megaphones, callers walking along the edge of the forest, pleading for him to emerge. But everything felt staged. Why would his family's handwriting be so perfect? Why would photos appear without official seals? Why would strangers call his name as if they knew him personally? A true Japanese officer would come in person. Until he saw one, everything was enemy trickery. That was the logic that kept him anchored. By 1949, the lines between reality and obligation blurred, and an event occurred that hardened his worldview further. While scouting near a riverbed, Onoda discovered a rusted metal container buried in silt. Inside were newspapers, magazines, and pamphlets, all printed in Japanese. At first glance, this seemed like proof that Japan still lived, still fought, still resisted. But the dates froze him. 1948 and 1949. Years after the war had supposedly ended. His heart pounded. If Japan had surrendered, who was printing these? How were they distributed? Why were they here? The simplest answer, the one any ordinary man would accept, was that the war was over and Japan had resumed peacetime printing. But Onoda was not ordinary. His mind, shaped by intelligence work, offered a different explanation. Japan must be occupied, publishing underground newspapers as part of a hidden resistance movement. Perhaps Japan had been forced into silence, but the war continued in another form. Perhaps he, too, was part of that resistance, isolated but essential. This interpretation soothed him, energized him, reaffirmed everything he believed. The war had not ended. It had changed. Japan still needed him. Across the ocean, of course, Japan had long since rebuilt and moved forward, but they had not forgotten him. Former commanders, government officials, family members, they searched for him tirelessly. They walked the beaches. They climbed into the forests. They called his name through megaphones. They dropped personal letters, real photos, verified documents. They begged him to come home. Yet every gesture made him withdraw further. Machines could fake voices. Paper could be forged. Only an officer of the Imperial Army could relieve him of duty, and none had come. Therefore, his mission continued. By the early 1950s, Onoda no longer felt as though he was hiding. Instead, he felt like the last remaining guardian of a mission the world had forgotten. He endured typhoons that uprooted trees, monsoons that flooded his shelter, fevers that left him weak for days, and hunger that clung to him like a second skin. His body changed. His muscles hardened. His frame grew lean. His face weathered like the bark of the trees surrounding him. But his spirit remained unbroken. As long as Japan had not relieved him of duty, surrender was impossible. His notebook became a catalogue of observations, villagers' movements, crop patterns, nighttime fires he believed were signals, changes in patrol habits he assumed were enemy tactics. Everything was interpreted through loyalty, duty, and devotion to an empire that, in his mind, still needed him. The world moved on. Japan rebuilt. Families healed. Nations rebuilt alliances. But deep within the Philippine jungle, Hiroo Onoda remained frozen in 1945, faithful, vigilant, enduring, and utterly unaware that history had already turned the page without him. December 1952, 4:55 a.m., as the first muted glow of dawn seeped through the tangled canopy of Lubang Island, Hiroo Onoda crouched beside a trickling stream, listening with the same heightened vigilance that had governed his life for nearly 8 years. For every rustle, every ripple, every distant crack of bamboo carried meaning in the war he still believed raged around him, and the quiet jungle seemed to whisper reminders of duty that time could not erode. By now, the jungle had shaped him. Into something between soldier and phantom, a lone figure who knew every ridge, every streambed, every grove of banana trees as intimately as he once knew the streets of his hometown, and he moved with a silent, predatory grace born not of cruelty but of training that told him survival was obedience, observation was strength, and hesitation was death. Onoda was no longer simply hiding. He was conducting an intelligence operation of extraordinary endurance. He mapped the villagers' routines in his mind, who walked to the fields at dawn, who carried tools, who traveled in groups, and he watched their habits with such detail that he could predict their movements days in advance. Yet far from softening him, these observations hardened his suspicion, for he could not fathom how the war could be over when the so-called civilians moved with such confidence, laughing, fishing, planting crops in the open, as if the Americans had never conquered them. No, Onoda concluded, these villagers were being controlled, manipulated, perhaps used as human shields by the enemy. Every calm smile, every relaxed gesture only deepened his mistrust. His orders were clear. He must not die. He must not surrender. He must continue gathering intelligence until an officer relieved him. That officer had never come. Therefore, the mission continued. Sometimes he thought of his fellow soldiers who began this exile with him. Private Yuichi Akotsu, the first to falter, had slipped away in 1949, his courage crumbling under the weight of endless hunger and fear. When Akotsu finally stumbled into the arms of Filipino authorities, Onoda interpreted it not as a defection but as a strategic leak, information tortured out of him by the enemy. Months later, leaflets appeared claiming Akotsu was safe in Japan, thanking villagers for kindness. Onoda read the message with a cold, quiet certainty. It was a fabrication. The Americans were skilled in deception. They knew that breaking one soldier's resolve could crack the rest. But he would not bend. Loyalty was his armor. In the early 1950s, he and the two remaining comrades, Corporal Shoichi Shimoda and Private Kinshichi Kozuka, moved deeper into the mountains, forming a tighter unit, building makeshift shelters under fallen logs, weaving bamboo walls to hide their fires, and creating hidden camps stocked with coconuts, dried bananas, and stolen rice. They slept in shifts, rifles always loaded, knives always within reach. Their uniforms, once crisp symbols of imperial pride, had become patchwork skins stitched with vines and cloth scraps, yet they wore them with enduring dignity. Each man preserved his rank, his salute, his military courtesy. The jungle may have reduced their world to shadows and storms, but the army still lived in their posture. In 1953, while scouting the lower slopes, they encountered a small group of Filipino harvesters gathering rice. To the islanders, these three ragged men emerging from the trees looked like ghosts, relics from a war long over. But Onoda saw enemy collaborators trespassing on restricted terrain. Believing they were intelligence assets of the Americans, he motioned to his men. Shots rang out, brief, controlled, deliberate. The harvesters fled, terrified. A dark silence followed. For the first time in years, Onoda felt the weight of irreversible action settle on his chest. Not guilt. He could not allow guilt, but gravity. If the enemy was reinforcing its civilian spies, he would have to escalate his vigilance. The Philippine government, realizing that the Japanese holdouts were not simply hiding but actively resisting, deployed search parties, but to Onoda these were combat patrols. He studied their movements from afar, analyzing their discipline, their routes, their equipment. They behaved with a casualness he interpreted as deception. No soldier would walk so openly unless he already controlled the area. He believed this was proof that the Americans were using the civilians as camouflage, staging the illusion of peacetime. As years dragged on, time became fluid, seasons marked not by calendars but by rainfall, typhoons, and mango harvests. Onoda watched decades change without knowing decades had passed. He kept his rifle pristine, disassembling and oiling it beneath shelters of palm leaves during monsoon rains, whispering to himself the maintenance routines taught in training school. He polished his officer's sword with the reverence of a shrine keeper, its blade gleaming even as his own body weathered. On nights when the rain fell with deafening force, drowning the jungle in sound, he sometimes imagined the distant rumble of Japanese artillery, phantom memories echoing through the storm. In moments like these, visions of Tokyo flickered in his mind: electric lights, streetcars, the smells of food stalls, the sound of a harmonica on a street corner. He wondered if his family still lived. He wondered if his brothers survived the war. But each time such thoughts arose, he suffocated them under duty. A soldier who longed for home was a soldier who endangered the mission. Over time, even reality began to warp under the strain of isolation. When Onoda found a newspaper from 1954, showing Japanese athletes competing abroad, he folded the pages over and over, staring in disbelief. How could Japan send athletes overseas during a global occupation? How could these photographs look so real? He inspected the ink, the fibers, the printing alignment. Too perfect, too elaborate. Only a major military power could produce forgeries of such quality. This, he reasoned, was American propaganda designed to break the will of remaining Japanese soldiers. He refused the bait. The fact that such a forgery existed only reinforced his belief that he was still vital. If the Americans needed to deceive him, then he still posed a threat. Then came 1959, the year Shimoda died. It happened near a coral outcrop when Filipino fishermen, startled by the trio's presence, shouted and fled. In the confusion, a gunshot cracked through the air. Shimoda fell. Onoda rushed to him, pressing a hand against his comrade's wound, whispering commands for him to breathe, to stay awake, to hold on as they carried him back to their hidden camp. But the jungle was too far, the blood too much. Shimoda died with the same stoic discipline he had lived, eyes steady, jaw clenched, refusing to cry out in pain. Onoda sat in silence long after the body grew cold. He had lost a soldier, a brother, a witness to the truth as he understood it. And with that loss, the mission grew heavier. Years continued to pass. Years Onoda did not count, for calendars no longer existed. He and Kozuka operated like a two-man recon team, executing small raids for supplies, burning rice stores to disrupt what they believed were enemy provisioning routes, studying changes in vegetation to track civilian encroachment, always vigilant, always ready to fade back into the foliage if voices approached. Their bond, strengthened by hardship and purpose, became something akin to shared consciousness, not friendship, not companionship, but synchronized duty. They no longer needed words. A tilt of the head, a shift of posture, a glance toward a ridge communicated everything necessary. If you already watched till this part, so please comment below your city name. Let's continue the story. And then came October 19th, 1972, a date that meant nothing to Onoda except through the lens of the mission. He and Kozuka were watching a group of villagers burning leftover rice stalks after harvest. To them, this was supply destruction, an enemy tactic used since ancient times. They moved in to intervene, believing they were disrupting enemy logistics. Shots were fired. Panic erupted. When the smoke cleared, Kozuka lay motionless on the ground, shot dead by Filipino police. Onoda froze. Not with fear, not with confusion, but with a sudden, profound hollowing, a silence inside his chest so vast it swallowed the sounds of the jungle. Kozuka, his last comrade, the final link to his wartime identity, was gone. For the first time in his life, Onoda felt truly alone. But he could not stop, could not surrender, could not allow despair to swallow duty. He buried Kozuka with calm, unbroken movements, placing his comrade's rifle beside him and saluting in the fading light. Then he melted into the trees once more. One man against a world he believed was still at war. By now, Japanese newspapers were filled with stories about a mysterious soldier still fighting in the Philippines. Japan had long since modernized, rebuilt cities, hosted world events, become an economic giant, but Onoda knew none of this. The world was changing around him faster than any human being could comprehend, yet in his mind, the war still burned with the same intensity it held in 1945. And so he watched, listened, survived, an unbroken spirit moving through a world that no longer matched the one he fought for. The jungle had become his armor, his map, his fortress, and his prison, and somewhere across the sea, a nation he no longer recognized was searching for him, calling for him, praying that he would one day emerge from the shadows and learn the truth. March 1973, 6:40 a.m., as pale morning light filtered through layers of mist clinging to the mountains of Lubang Island, Hiroo Onoda moved silently along a narrow ridge, each step calibrated with the same discipline he had maintained since 1944, unaware that the world beyond this jungle had shifted into an entirely new age, unaware that Japan had rebuilt itself into a peaceful industrial titan, unaware that people now carried cameras more often than rifles. He only knew the language of rustling leaves, of distant splashes in riverbeds, of the rhythmic chirping of cicadas that warned him when something in the environment had changed, and lately, he sensed change everywhere. Not in the war he still believed raged, but in the strange increase in foreign voices echoing through the valleys, voices that did not speak with the hardened authority of soldiers yet moved with a persistence that unsettled him. Reports had circulated through Lubang's villages for months. A foreign man, young, adventurous, seemingly careless, was roaming the jungle asking specifically for Onoda, calling his name, leaving notes tied to branches, even shouting declarations into the fog as if he believed a soldier in hiding would simply respond to a stranger's plea. This man was Norio Suzuki, a wandering Japanese traveler who had told friends he sought three things: Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman. But to Onoda, Suzuki's presence was not charming, it was alarming. The Americans, he reasoned, had finally learned that impersonating Japanese relatives and dropping forged letters had failed. Now they were escalating the deception, sending agents fluent in Japanese to trick him. Onoda's vigilance sharpened. Every footprint, every broken twig, every unnatural sound in the forest was analyzed with the cold precision of a soldier who had survived 3 decades under the belief that the enemy never rested. Yet fate had a different path in mind. On February 20, 1974, while patrolling near a steep hillside of wild banana groves, Onoda heard footsteps, light, unhurried, careless in a way no soldier would dare move. He melted behind a cluster of trees, rifle ready, eyes narrowed. Then the figure emerged, a slim young man with an open, enthusiastic face and no weapon visible. He wore a bright shirt, an absurd choice in a combat zone, and he walked as if strolling through a park instead of a battlefield. Onoda followed his movements, calculating angles, evaluating dangers, but the man suddenly turned directly toward where Onoda hid and called out in fluent, unmistakably sincere Japanese, "Onoda-san, I have been looking for you." The words froze Onoda's breath. No enemy soldier would speak like that. No American intelligence agent would expose himself so recklessly. The young man took a step closer, then another, until the two men stood only a few paces apart. Onoda stepped from the shadows, rifle lifted. Suzuki did not flinch. Instead, he smiled, a wide, fearless, utterly baffling smile, and said, "Onoda-san, it's okay. Japan is waiting for you." The sincerity in his voice struck Onoda deeper than any bullet. For the first time in 29 years, someone was speaking to him without hostility, without deception, without fear. But he still could not surrender. His orders stood. He must hold his position until an officer relieved him. Suzuki spent hours speaking to him, answering questions Onoda asked with cautious suspicion, describing what Japan had become. Skyscrapers, bullet trains, peace, prosperity, but Onoda remained unconvinced. "If the war is truly over," he said. "I must receive orders from my commanding officer. Otherwise, my mission continues." Suzuki nodded solemnly, understanding that this was no madness. This was loyalty so absolute it had outlived the war itself. When Suzuki finally returned to Japan, he carried with him the knowledge that Onoda could be saved, but only through the voice of the one man Onoda would obey. That man was Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. Taniguchi had long believed Onoda dead. When Suzuki arrived at his home and said, "Sir, Lieutenant Onoda is alive and still carrying out your orders," the aging officer stared at him in stunned silence. The military had moved on. Japan had renounced war. The empire Onoda had sworn to defend no longer existed. Yet one man was still fighting for it, alone in a jungle that time had forgotten. Taniguchi agreed to fly to Lubang, not as a commander reclaiming a soldier, but as an old man bearing the weight of responsibility he never knew remained. March 9, 1974, 2 p.m., beneath a canopy of towering mahogany trees where cicadas screamed loud enough to shake the air, Hiroo Onoda stood before a figure he had not seen since 1945. Taniguchi approached slowly, wearing his old uniform, not out of ceremony but because Onoda would accept no other authority. The officer's face had aged, lined with decades Onoda had never witnessed, yet his posture still held the remnants of command. Onoda felt a tremor run through him. Not of fear, but of something he had forgotten how to feel. Recognition. Taniguchi opened a folder, withdrew typed documents, and in a steady voice read Onoda's final orders. "Lieutenant Onoda, the Imperial Army now orders you to cease all combat activity. The war ended in August 1945. All units have surrendered. You are relieved of duty." Silence fell heavy. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. Onoda lowered his rifle, the weapon he had carried through storms, hunger, battles, and decades of isolation, and he felt its weight disappear not from his hands but from his soul. For 29 years he had lived by a single purpose. Now that purpose was gone. Moments later, Onoda removed his sword, his rifle, his ammunition, even his functioning grenades, and presented them to Taniguchi with ceremonial precision. As he did, tears streamed down his face, not for surrender, but for the realization that the Japan he fought for no longer existed. He said quietly, "Major, I apologize for taking so long." Taniguchi placed a hand on his shoulder, voice breaking as he replied, "It was we who left you behind." Word spread quickly through the Philippines and Japan. The final Japanese holdout had emerged. What stepped out of the jungle was not a relic or a curiosity, but a man shaped by discipline so unbreakable that even the collapse of an empire could not shake it. When Onoda walked into the nearest village for the first time, villagers watched in awe. This soldier who had lived unseen among them for decades, who had stalked the same hillsides they cultivated, who believed their peaceful lives were staged acts in a global war, now walked through their streets in full uniform, with dignity intact. Many expected hostility. Instead, Onoda apologized deeply for the violence he had caused. The Philippine government pardoned him, recognizing that he had acted under orders, believing himself still at war. Onoda returned to Japan on March 12, 1974. When he stepped off the plane, he entered a world so transformed he felt like a man visiting the future. Neon lights, televisions, highways, modern clothes, everything overwhelmed him. Crowds gathered to witness his return, cheering his name, greeting him as a symbol of loyalty and unbroken spirit, but Onoda stood stiffly in his faded uniform, unsure where he belonged. The country was no longer the homeland he remembered. The war-torn streets he had left behind were now sprawling cities. The culture he fought to protect had evolved into something unfamiliar. He felt adrift. Yet Japan embraced him. They did not mock him for holding on to a war long ended. They revered him for his devotion, for representing a kind of duty and integrity that had vanished with time. Even so, Onoda struggled. He had lived by survival, vigilance, suspicion. Now he was asked to live in peace. He tried to adjust, even writing a memoir, No Surrender, recounting his experiences, but the noise of modern Japan weighed on him heavily. Eventually he moved to Brazil, seeking simplicity and quiet, living on a ranch surrounded not by war but by open sky. And still, despite everything he endured, he remained loyal, not to an emperor or a vanished empire, but to the code that shaped him: perseverance, purpose, duty. His war had lasted 29 years. His peace would finally begin. April 1974, 7:15 a.m., as soft morning light spilled across the vast coastlines of Japan, Hiroo Onoda stood on a quiet balcony in Tokyo, staring at a horizon he no longer recognized, the skyline filled with steel towers and shimmering glass that reflected the sun like blades of silver, each one a monument to a country that had been rebuilt in the decades he spent fighting a war that no longer existed. And as he listened to the hum of passing cars and distant trains, the city's rhythm felt alien, too fast, too loud, too modern for a man who had survived nearly 30 years with nothing but a rifle, a knife, and unwavering obedience to orders. He felt as though he had traveled not from one nation to another, but from one era into a future he was never meant to see. Crowds gathered everywhere he went, some cheering, some bowing, some merely curious. Yet their admiration unsettled him, for they applauded his endurance, praised his devotion, and called him a hero, but they did not understand the cost of those years, the weight of silence, the loneliness of watching seasons change over and over while believing that every sunrise was another day in a war he had no choice but to continue. Though he smiled politely and answered reporters' questions, inside he felt a drifting unease, as if he had stepped out of a dream only to wake in another one. At night, when the city glowed with neon lights that pulsed like electric constellations, Onoda often sat by a window and wondered whether there had been signs, moments in the jungle when doubt had whispered through the leaves, when he might have questioned the mission more deeply, when he might have stepped forward to test the truth the world had tried so desperately to deliver. But those thoughts brought no comfort. His orders had been clear, and following them had kept him alive. Loyalty had been his compass. And now, stripped of that mission, he felt unmoored. In interviews, he admitted that the world felt too busy, that people seemed to move with a speed and confidence he did not possess, that he felt more at home listening to the rustling of trees than to the buzz of fluorescent signs. Japan had changed, and he had not. The empire he fought for existed only in memory, replaced by a peaceful society that no longer valued sacrifice in the way he had been trained to understand it. Where once the country spoke of duty and national spirit, now it spoke of commerce, innovation, and global cooperation. Where once families feared the future, now they built it with eager hands. And still, the people of Japan looked upon him with a reverence that bordered on awe. They brought gifts, letters, and offerings of gratitude. Former soldiers saluted him in the streets. Elders thanked him for his devotion. Students studied his story in books. Yet admiration could not erase the truth that Onoda was a man displaced, emotionally, culturally, and spiritually. His mind had survived 3 decades of war, but adapting to peace was a far greater challenge. He found himself waking at dawn, scanning rooftops out of instinct, interpreting the sound of footsteps in hallways as potential threats, analyzing shadows cast by street lamps with the same suspicion he once applied to the Philippine jungle. Even mundane objects, metal pipes, stray wires, reflections in shop windows, triggered memories of traps and ambushes. He realized that while the world had moved past the war had not yet moved past him. He tried to reintegrate with purpose, even taking part in ceremonies honoring the dead, but the density of human interaction felt overwhelming. Crowded rooms suffocated him. Flashing cameras reminded him of muzzle bursts in nighttime skirmishes. Applause sounded like artillery echoes rolling across hills. The intense contrast between his lived reality and Japan's rapid modernization left him longing for something simpler, something closer to the world he understood: nature, discipline, solitude. Eventually, with gentle encouragement from friends and supporters, Onoda decided to leave Japan temporarily and seek a quieter life abroad. Brazil called to him, not for its modern cities, but for its open land, its quiet forests, its slower rhythm, and the possibility of starting fresh. He moved to the state of Mato Grosso, where he worked on a cattle ranch and lived in a small community surrounded by vast plains and thick tropical forests that reminded him of the Philippines, but without the enemy patrols, without the paranoia, without the purpose that once drove him. Instead, Brazil offered something he had long forgotten how to embrace: peace. And in that peace, Onoda found clarity. He realized that he had survived not only because of discipline but because of resilience, because he refused to surrender to despair, because he believed in something larger than himself, even if that belief had been anchored to a world that no longer existed. Slowly, he began to rebuild not just his life but his identity, transforming his wartime instincts into lessons about duty, survival, and endurance. Onoda became known among his Brazilian neighbors not as a former soldier, but as a symbol of strength, teaching survival skills, offering guidance to youth, and sharing the same principles that had kept him alive: awareness, patience, adaptability. He spent long afternoons walking through the forests, observing wildlife not as threats but as companions, learning the rhythms of a land that did not ask him to fight, only to exist. Yet he never fully abandoned Japan. He returned periodically, especially after founding the Onoda Nature School, an organization dedicated to teaching children the values of perseverance, respect for nature, and mental resilience, values he believed modern society was forgetting. Through these teachings, Onoda discovered something unexpected. He could still serve Japan, not as a soldier but as a mentor. He spoke to young people about hardship, not glorifying war but emphasizing the importance of endurance when facing life's battles. He described the jungle not as an enemy but as a teacher that revealed weaknesses and built strength. He spoke with a calm intensity that commanded attention, a presence shaped by decades of solitude and certainty. And as he shared his experiences, he realized that his true war had not been fought with bullets or ambushes, but with doubt, loneliness, and the burden of obedience he carried across time. Even so, shadows of the past lingered. There were moments when sudden sounds, cracking branches, popping engines, fireworks, brought him instantly back to Lubang, when his body tensed and his mind replayed the countless nights he spent waiting for an unseen enemy. Trauma, though buried, never vanished completely. But unlike in the years immediately after his return, Onoda now had tools to cope: purpose, community, understanding. He learned to let memory inform him without consuming him. As decades passed, Onoda became not only a historical figure but a philosophical one, an emblem of unwavering commitment in a world built increasingly on convenience and speed. Journalists, historians, and students sought him out, not simply to recount the bizarre nature of his 29-year holdout, but to understand the mindset of a man who had lived by honor beyond reason. Some criticized him, arguing that obedience had cost innocent lives during his guerrilla years. Onoda never denied this. He acknowledged the harm caused, expressed remorse, and insisted that war, any war, twists morality until good men do destructive things in the name of duty. It was a truth he carried heavily. Yet many saw in him something profoundly human: the need for purpose. The same quality that kept him alive in the jungle allowed him to thrive later as a teacher, rancher, and cultural figure who bridged two worlds, the war-torn past and the peaceful present. And as he aged, his once rigid posture softened, his voice mellowed, and his reflections deepened. He often said that the world seemed obsessed with speed, that people hurried without understanding where they were going, that they feared silence because silence exposed their uncertainties. "The jungle taught me to listen," he would say. "Modern life teaches people to run." By the time he entered his 80s, Onoda had become a living artifact of a vanished era, a reminder of how absolute belief can shape the human spirit for better or worse, and how even the longest war must eventually end, not through surrender but through acceptance. Even as his steps grew slower and his breath shallower, his mind remained sharp, anchored by memories that stretched across generations. To many Japanese citizens, he embodied the endurance their ancestors once lived by. To others, he symbolized the dangers of blind obedience. But to everyone who heard his story, one truth was undeniable. Hiroo Onoda had lived a life unlike any other. January 2014, 6:25 a.m., as the winter sun rose slowly over the quiet coastline of Japan, its pale orange light stretching across a calm sea that glittered like glass. Hiroo Onoda awoke for what would be one of the final mornings of his extraordinary life, unaware that history was preparing to close the last chapter of a story that had begun in a jungle half a century earlier. He sat at a small wooden table in his Tokyo home, surrounded by neatly arranged notebooks, letters from former students, and photographs of Brazil's wide-open plains, each image a reminder of the many lives he had lived after returning from the war, and as he sipped tea in the peaceful silence, he felt something he had rarely allowed himself to feel in the decades since his emergence from Lubang Island: stillness. The world outside his window moved gently, cars humming past the gate, bicycles rattling by on cold pavement, neighbors greeting the day with soft chatter, and for the first time in years, he did not analyze these sounds for danger or patterns. Age had softened the instincts that once guided him through the jungle with razor precision, and though memories still visited him like distant voices carried on evening winds, they no longer controlled him. He had learned, slowly and painfully, to exist in a world where purpose did not come from a commander but from choice, from teaching, from reflection, from understanding. In the final years of his life, Onoda spent his time traveling between Japan and Brazil, nurturing the nature school he founded, speaking with parents and children who looked at him not as a soldier but as a sage, someone who had endured the unimaginable and emerged with lessons not about war, but about perseverance, unity, and gratitude. He believed deeply that modern society had lost touch with struggle, that the ease of daily life had weakened the spirit, and so he taught young people how to push through hardship without surrendering to fear. He walked through forests with them, teaching them how to observe without rushing, how to read the wind, how to move with awareness, how to respect the earth beneath their feet. He told them, quietly, almost as if whispering a truth meant only for them, to know yourself, you must face something difficult, even if it scares you. These teachings resonated across generations. Former students would write to him from around the world, crediting his lessons with helping them through failures, loss, confusion, and moments when they felt overwhelmed by life's expectations. It was a legacy far greater than he ever expected to leave. Though he had long made peace with his past, he carried a silent sorrow that never fully left him, a regret not for obeying orders, but for the harm caused during his decades on Lubang, for the fear he instilled in villagers who were simply trying to rebuild their lives after the war. Whenever interviewed about those years, Onoda spoke with a solemn calm, acknowledging that his actions, though rooted in duty, existed in a tragic conflict between loyalty and truth. War distorts everything, he would say, even the meaning of right and wrong. His honesty won him respect even from those who viewed his holdout as misguided. In the end, he became not a symbol of military endurance, but a symbol of the human complexity behind loyalty, a man shaped by conviction, trapped by circumstance, and redeemed by reflection. As Onoda grew older, he began revisiting places connected to his life, almost as if preparing himself for closure. He walked through Tokyo's Imperial Palace gardens, where cherry blossoms drifted softly around him like pale pink snow, reminding him of the youth he once had, the army he once served, and the emperor he once pledged to protect. He visited Lubang Island one last time, standing quietly in the jungle that had been his home for 3 decades. Villagers welcomed him warmly, offering smiles and gentle bows. The forest felt smaller now, less threatening, almost peaceful. It no longer held him captive. Instead, it stood as a monument to the endurance that had defined him. He closed his eyes and listened to the familiar sounds: rustling leaves, distant waves crashing on rocks, the faint buzzing of insects in the heat, and for a moment he felt as though both versions of himself, the soldier and the old man, stood together in harmony. In his final months, Onoda reflected often on purpose. He believed that modern life allowed people too many distractions, too many escapes from themselves. When you have nothing, he would tell young listeners, you learn what matters. When you face hardship, you discover who you are. These words were not spoken with pride but with clarity, shaped by 30 years of isolation in a jungle where every decision mattered, where survival depended on discipline, and where each sunset brought the possibility that tomorrow might not come. Yet he never glorified his suffering. Instead, he used it to illuminate the importance of resilience, humility, and perseverance. As winter deepened in early 2014, his health began to fade gently, like the slow dimming of a lantern at dusk. He remained calm, surrounded by letters, books, and moments of quiet contemplation. On January 16th, he passed away peacefully, leaving behind a world that struggled to comprehend the magnitude of his story. News spread swiftly across Japan, then across the globe. Hiroo Onoda, the soldier who fought for 29 years after the war, the man once feared by villagers, the man once misunderstood by the world, had died at the age of 91. Journalists wrote tributes. Historians revisited his story. Former students wept quietly. Even those who questioned his decisions acknowledged the profound humanity of a life shaped by duty, tested by isolation, and transformed by understanding. But the greatest legacy Onoda left behind was not the extraordinary length of his holdout. It was the lessons drawn from it. That belief can sustain a person through unimaginable hardship. That purpose, even when misplaced, can give meaning to a life. That loyalty, when tempered by reflection, can evolve into wisdom. And that no matter how long darkness lasts, a person can still find their way back into the light. Hiroo Onoda's story became a reminder that history is not made only by battles and empires, but by individuals who carry convictions so deeply that they outlive the world that created them. In the end, he was not the last soldier of a fallen empire. He was the last echo of an era defined by unyielding devotion, and when that echo finally faded, it left behind a silence filled not with sorrow, but with profound respect. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.